Hello, here is what I hope is a fairly quick video about DOM form input. So one of the things that we often want to do with a web page is get data from the user, right? We want them to be able to input text or numbers or move a slider around, all of those sorts of usual interface elements that you're maybe used to seeing in forms online. And to do that, we need to combine a couple of things, right? We need elements in the HTML that represent standard user interface things like checkboxes or text input or color pickers or anything of those sorts of anything along those sorts of lines. Then we also need JavaScript that can kind of deal with the results of the user actually interacting with them. And so what I want to look at in this video is what are some of those HTML elements and how do we include them? And how do we do some basic JavaScript to at least extract the values that the user has put in? Okay, so without further ado, let's take a look. It's so easy a baby could do it. Right, so the first thing that we're going to need to do, of course, is we're going to need a project to actually work in. So once again, I am going to go into my topics folder, my web page folder, and I'm going to make one more folder called DOM form input, and I'm going to open that up in Atom. And it's empty, so I'm going to, again, as always, I'm going to create a file. That file is going to be index.html, and that's where I'm going to write my web page. And then I know I'm going to be using JavaScript, so I'm also going to create a JS folder, and I'm going to put a script.js in there. Okay, so the first side of this is like, what is the HTML element that I can use to get some input from the user? And so to do that, I'm going to need a web page. So let's actually just quickly build this very simple web page from scratch. So doc type HTML, we always need that. Then we have the HTML tag. I'll close it down here. And then we have the head tag, of course, and in there it's a good idea to have a title. And I'm just going to say input examples here. So it's a page of input examples, and I'm going to close my head tag like a good person, and then I'm going to have the body of my document. Now, I know that I'm going to want to have a script running on this page, so I'm going to include my script as is convention at the bottom of my body tag. So I'm going to give a script tag with a source of js/script.js because that's where my script is, and then I'm going to close it there. And it's going to go weird, so I'm going to close it and open it again. Thank you very much, whatever causes that in my editor. So now we've got a simple web page. It doesn't do very much. Let's add an h1 tag so we can at least have a label at the top. I'll just say input examples. So now I can run this page. So let's at least have it running so that we can take a look at it. Okay, so here's my input examples page. I'm not doing a whole hell of a lot because it doesn't do anything yet. So there is now the question, right? What element can I put in here to allow for user interaction? And perhaps the quintessential interactive element is a button. So how do I make a button? And the answer is that we can basically make almost every single kind of input that we want to create with an element called input, literally like this. It's one of those elements that does not have a closing tag, so I don't need the paired tag with the /. I just call it input. Clearly on its own, not going to do a whole lot because it's too generic, right? So what we do with the input tag is we can tell it what type of input it is. We say type, and what kind of type is it? And you can actually see the list here in my editor, right? And there's a bunch: button, checkbox, color, date time, email, file, hidden, image, etc. And so I want a button, so I'm going to say that the type is button. That will create a button on my web page. What does it look like right now? Not so amazing. There it is there. It's got its beveled corners. You can see it highlights when I mouse over it, so it's got some built-in kind of style stuff, and I can click it, and it will be clicked. Probably I want to label this button though, right? And the way that I label the button is I give it a value. This is a button. So it has a value attribute, and the thing in the value attribute is the label that will end up on my button. So there you go. This is a button. Click, 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 click. Wonderful. Now, this is such a common task that you can actually make a button with a different tag specifically just for making buttons, right? So I can also make a button this way. Button just a button tag. I'm sorry, that's what I mean. There's just a tag on its own. And then here, in between the open tag and the close tag, I can also say this is also a button. This will be the label of the button. Yep, so these are my two buttons. This is a button, this is also a button. So those are two ways of doing exactly the same thing. I have a mild preference for just always using the standard input element tag, but it's completely up to you. If you prefer this kind of notation using the button tag, that's fine. Completely up to you. But I'm going to work with just this button here. So what do I need to be able to react to with a button? I need to be able to react to a click, right? And we already know from looking at how we handle DOM events that the way that we would do that is with an event listener on the button. So how am I going to get hold of the button in order to listen to it? Generally speaking, it's a very good idea to have an ID. So let's call this example button. Let's give it an ID attribute example button. The reason that we give it this ID is because I want to get access to it in my script. I could also use that to style it with CSS, right? I'm not going to do that, but that's the other thing that we use the ID for. So now with this ID, I know that in my script over here, I can say let, I'm just going to call it button, is assigned document.getElement by ID. What was the ID? It was example button. So now I've got access to the button element on my page. I know that if I want to check whether the user clicked on it, I can say button.addEventListener. And then I say what kind of event? It's a click event. And what do I want to do? Well, I want to call this function. I'm making it an anonymous function. And what do I want to do here? Well, this is where I do whatever I want to do when the button got clicked, right? I could say nice clicking. Nice clicking. Nice clicking. No, nice clicking is better. Nice clicking. So every time I click on it, I'm going to get an alert that says nice clicking. So I click it. Nice clicking. Click it. Nice clicking. This is making me feel good. I'm going to click it one more time. Click it. Nice clicking. Thank you. Thank you. Or I could do, anything else. For example, what if I did event.target, which is the thing that got clicked, right? In this case, we know it's the button. And I set its display, which is one of its CSS properties, to none. What would this give us? This would give us a disappearing button. Oh. It's gone. I kind of like that. There's already something very fun about the fact that there's a button and you click it and it's gone. That's a whole problematic usability experience that I think is quite fun. So it's a button, you click it, and it sets its own display to none. So that's how you make a button, right? In JavaScript, you get access to the button with something like getElementById or a different selection method. You add a click listener onto it, and then you do what you want to do inside that click handler event. That's it. That's buttons. That's all you need to know. Okay. Let us look at another kind of input that we might want to do, and that is text input. We very, very often want to get text input, right? So let's make a text input. And again, we begin with the standard input tag. Let me just actually delete this code here while I'm thinking of it. So a standard input tag, again, we need to specify the type. What is the type going to be? It's text. So input with an attribute of text for its type will give us a text input box. Hello, nice clicking. Or whatever I want to type in there, right? It's a text entry box that we can get text info from the user into that box. Right now, though, hard to do anything with the text input because how do we know when they're finished? So what's the typical way that we process information that's in a text field? We use a button, don't we? So let's add a button that's going to sit after the text box. And let's say we'll call it submit, since that's a good name for this kind of thing. So then we've got a text input and then a button that says submit. So now we're starting to look like a real web page. I feel great. And then I click submit and something happens. But of course, nothing happens because there's no JavaScript associated with this. So what do I want to do? Well, again, it makes sense to add ID attributes to these. So I'm going to call this example text input. And this one is going to have an ID of example. I'll just call this submit button, actually. That would make sense. So with these IDs, I can again access them in my script. What am I going to do? Well, it's a little bit more complicated this time, right? So the first thing I need access to both of these things. So first of all, my text input is going to be document.getElement by ID, example text input. That's going to be the element that has the text input field in it. Then I also want my button, so document.getElement by ID. That was called submit button. So now I've got access to the two of those things in my program. And so what do I want to do? Well, I know that I want to react to a button click. So once again, I'm going to add the click event listener, add event listener, click to my button, right? And again, I'll just use an anonymous function here. So once I'm in here, inside here, I know that they clicked the button. What do I want to do? Well, because it's associated with the text field on this web page, I want to do something with the text that's been written into the text field here. How am I going to do that? Well, I need to get access to that text. And how do I do that? Well, I'll tell you. The text input that we have there has a special property that we can use to access the information in it called value. So let's separate that out. We'll say that the input is the text input element, which is the actual text box itself, dot value. And this contains the text that has been typed in there. So what will I do for now? For now, I'm just going to say alert input, so we'll get it printed out. So I type something in, hello, and then I click submit. That calls the click event handler, and that does an alert with the value inside my text box, and it says hello. What happens if there's nothing in there? Out of interest, I don't know. Submit, nothing. I guess it's just an empty string. I wondered if it might be undefined, but in fact it's an empty string. If I reload the page and do it, still an empty string. Okay, so if there's nothing in there, it's an empty string. So with this, right, we can do anything we want to do with the text field, and then we click the button, get the value out, and then we do something with that. We, save the username, or we add the line to the epic poem that the user is composing, or whatever it is that we want to do. This is just a very simple example, right? Okay, let's carry on. So another way that you might want to allow input into your text field is you might want to be able to detect the user doing something like pressing the return key and saying that's how they're going to enter input. And we can do that too. Let's add that to our script. So if I'm detecting that they're pressing enter, I could detect it on the entire page, the entire document. But as soon as I have more than one text field, that's going to be a bit silly, right? What we really want to do is know when the user presses enter while they are typing in the text input. And so to do that, this is one of those cases where I can listen for a key press specifically inside the text input element. So I'm going to say text input, add event listener. What am I want to listen for? I'm going to listen for key down. That means doen. That means they pressed a key. Again, we have our event handler here. And what am I going to do? I need to check what key they pressed, right? And I know that the key code property of the event will tell me that. So if event.keycode is 13, which is the enter key or return key, then maybe I will print out what's inside the text input. So I'm going to do the same thing here, these two lines here, right? So get the value that's in the text field and alert it, print it out to the user. So the difference here is that now I can type hello world. Instead of just clicking submit, I can also hit return. So I'm going to hit return now, and it comes up, right? So it's just a different way of using that input. Now, there's obviously more to each of these particular different types of input, and as you might imagine, it's worth kind of reading the documentation to find out more. I'm trying to go quickly here just because I want to make sure that we just kind of get through this and you can then learn more things. If you go and look at the documentation though, one kind of neat thing that is available to us for a text field is there's other attributes that we can set, right? For example, there's an attribute called max length. Max length, good grief, I can't type. Max length, where we can say how many characters the input is allowed to have. So maybe I'll limit it to 8. What does that do? Well, it literally enforces it, right? So now I can type hello, but I can't type more than that M because that's 8 characters. So if you're wanting to really enforce particular rules, there are often attributes that shape the data that's allowed to be entered in different ways. There's all kinds of interesting things. Again, worth reading the actual documentation. Again, I favor Mozilla's documentation in order to learn more of these sorts of things. So that's text input. We've got a text input thing happening. what else could we do? Well, I think one of the other neat things that we can do, a form of input that I personally really like, for reasons I don't entirely understand, is the slider. So I'm going to delete my code again, start fresh, delete these people here. They're not people. Those are HTML tags. They're not people, Pippin. And let's do a slider. So again, input tag, specific type. What is the type? The type in this case for a slider is not the word slider, which is also a kind of hamburger, I know, but range. Maybe that's why they didn't call it slider. People were getting confused and trying to eat it. So there's a range input. So what does that look like if I just go and look at it now? Oh, there you go. It's one of these things, right? So slidey, 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 slidey. Now this is working with some default values, right? I, by looking at it, and I'm sure this is true of you too, cannot tell what value this is and what value that is. So we'll have to just kind of find out. And let's do that. So let us write a script to, again, tell us what the value is inside the slider. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to need another button, right, to get access to it. So let's add a button. So input, goodness me, input type is button, and its value is going to be, I don't know, check, because it's going to check the value of the slider. And we probably should add, again, IDs to these. So I'm going to call this one example slider ID, and this one is going to be ID check button. That'll do, right? So again, now we've got our interface elements, we've got a slider, and we've got a button that I can click to check what's going on with the slider. Now I need my script is going to get access to those two elements. So the slider is going to be document.getElement by ID example slider, and my button is going to be document.getElement by ID. Was it check button? I've already forgotten what I called it. Let's go and check. Yes, check button. So I want to do this when I click on the button, so I'm going to add an event listener to the button. Add event listener. It must be wonderful watching me type this over and over again. But it's good to do it from scratch each time. Anonymous function. And what am I going to do? I just want to print out the value of the slider. How might I get the value of the slider? It's actually what you would think. So let value is slider, which is the element representing the slider, dot value. Dot value will give us the value that is currently installed, is currently set on the slider, and finally I can print that out to the user. Now we can actually answer the question of like, what value is the slider actually working on? So let's go take a look. If I click it now, it's at 50. So this is kind of telling us what the defaults are, right? So that's at 50. If I move it to the top, it's at 100. And guess what? If I move it to the bottom, it's at 0. So you can tell, therefore, that the defaults are, there's three defaults going on here, right? There is a minimum, which is 0. There's a maximum, which is 100. And there's the current value that it's set to when my page loads, which is by default halfway between at 50, right? Now I can change those. There's attributes for those as well. For example, I might want a slider that goes between 1 and 0 and 1. That could be a good thing. So how do I do that? I set what am I talking about here? The minimum is going to be 0. The maximum is the max attribute. You can read this in the documentation. Is going to be 1. What's going to happen? Let's take a look. There it is. And, oh, so that's not very good, is it? It can only go between 0 and 1 by being either 0 or 1. It's kind of nice because it's kind of like a light switch now. Maybe you could use this as a light switch. But if I wanted this to return like little numbers, what would I do if I little numbers, floating point numbers between 0 and 1? What can I do? The thing that I need to change is like the increment that the slider moves in, because right now it moves in increments of 1, which is not helping me. And it turns out, yes, there is another attribute called step in this case, which I can set to be, let's say, 0.01. And that will change the slider's ability to, like, now it's got a nice kind of fluidity, so I can set it to there and check what it is, and it's 0.78, for example. Wonderful. Now I could be a random number generator by just going da 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 da. I'm closing my eyes, and then what do we get? 0.65. Okay. So that is a slider. We create a type of a range type input element. We can specify a min, a max, and a step, and then again we can check what's in it by getting its value property. In this case, I've done that by using a button. There is another way, though, that you could also check a slider without needing a button, and let's do that one as well. So let's get rid of our button. How could we check the value if there's no button? Well, it would make sense if we sort of moved the slider, and when we let go, we could react to the new value that it's set to, and we can do that. So let's do that in our script. So we just need the slider, and we can add an event listener, add event listener to our slider, which is called change. And this is going to be set off every time, guess what? Every time the value changes in the slider. So let's define our function, our event, our function, and again, we can do the same thing, right? Alert slider.value. Again, obviously you're going to want to do something slightly more exciting than alerting people of what values things are set to, but just for proof of concept. So now I can drag this, set it something like that, and let go, and it tells me it's at 0.14. So every time I drag and let go, i.e. I set it to something, my script can react to it. Oh, I got it perfectly at 0.8. There's a game in that, right? If I wanted to set it to perfectly 0.5, what do you reckon? There. Damn it! 0.49. Anyway, so there you go. We've got a slider and it works. Wonderful. Now, there's just so many of these things. I don't want to just keep going over and over every single one. The basic principle is kind of the same each time. You create an input element with a specific type that you're interested in, and then you write JavaScript that uses events in order to respond to that particular element. So let's just rush through another couple of examples because there's some really cool stuff in here. Let's make a color picker. Color picker, its type is called color when you're making a color picker, and we don't obviously need these slider settings here. Let's go look at the color picker. It's really quite nice. There it is. Kind of underwhelming, but if you click on it, whoa, whoa, wow, you can let the user input RGB colors into your thing. There, I set it. Again, didn't do anything. What could I do with it? Well, it would be pretty neat if I could set a color and then it would change the background color of my page to that color. That would be neat. So how would I do that? Well, in my script, I would make a variable to contain my color picker, document.get element by ID. What did I call it? I've already forgotten. Color picker. And then I can add, guess what? An event listener, add event listener. And what do I listen for? There's another thing that I can listen for, which is input, which is neat. I could listen for change. Let's listen for change first, actually. Listen for change. Sounds like a good telephone. And so how do I get the color out? You guessed it. I can get the color out by getting the value property of my picker. So picker.value. I could also use event.target here, of course. And then if I want to set the color of my background to that, well, let's see what it is first. Let's see what it's actually giving us. So alert, what am I calling it? Alert color. So when I change the color picker to red, it tells me it's this. So it's just a hexadecimal, right? It's B6 2020, classic B6 2020. So that's good to know. So I can just directly set that in as the color of my web page by doing document.body, which gives me the body element on my page. .style background color is assigned the color that we just got out of the color picker, right? So now every time I change the color picker, it's going to set the background. So here we go. Let's pick a good color. Feeling a little intimidated. That's pretty good. Voila! I've got a color picker that changes the color of my page. If I wanted that to be even kind of cooler, I could change this into what is called an input event. And the input event is a bit different because it happens more often. It's happening the entire time that you change anything. So as I drag my mouse around here, it's changing the background color, right? This is pretty cool. I'm feeling like a pretty cool person right now. What's good? That's pretty good. That's good? I don't know. Doesn't matter. So that's a color picker. And there's more and more and more of these things. I could keep going, but I kind of suspect that you get the idea. There's a couple more examples in the notes for this, and there's much, much more if you read the Mozilla Forms documentation, which has like specific discussion of all of the possible things that you can put into a form. Again, the most important thing to read about really is this input element, because that's really the thing that lets you do all kinds of different inputs, right? Here they all are here. There's a checkbox. there's a color picker, etc. You can really get the sense of what's available. And there's quite a lot of nice stuff available there. So go forth and have fun making input, for that is your destiny. And that's my opinion as a baby. I'll see you next time.